Still snow on the ground, but today's at least the first day this week. It has been right at the point of freezing. So it seems like a good time to look into. Hi, Misha here. And last time we talked about basically the birth of the Finnish military, their small arms industry, and the Winter War, and kind of where things were at in March of 1940. And we talked about the machine pistol 1931, the KP-31, the Suomi. Excellent gun. First generation subgun, but one of the best of the war, designed for very, very cold weather. And yeah, basically a single shot rifle or multiple shot submachine gun, machine gun, even light machine gun in service. So today we're going to talk about the aftermath, the continuation war, and we'll talk about the short-lived, but still very important, Lapland War. This is where things get a lot more ambiguous with Finland. Although there's still a major lesson to be learned about Russia invading a smaller nation and international alliances and all that good stuff. So before we dive in, as usual, check out our older videos. Like, share, and subscribe, and help us out on Patreon. A lot of these kind of porch-type historical videos are because Patreons talk about them. Sure, with no further ado, what happened? Why did Finland join the Axis powers, and why was it the only Axis nation not to be severely punished or outright occupied after World War II? So, following the Treaty of Moscow, basically Finland lost land and industrial resources, but was independent. And while the French and the British had talked with Finland during the Winter War, and a lot of international people had gone to volunteer there, it was a lot of kind of, well, that's a shame, Russia's invading, we'd love to help, if you can just hang on, we'll send troops, a lot of promises, a lot of sympathy, but in the end, it was Finland versus Russia. And Finland had had a relationship with the Germans going back to the Kaiser days in 1917, 1918. And there were right-wing folks in Finland. You had some left-wing, kind of communist-leaning political figures in Finland. You have some right-wing. Germany's on the march in 1940. Italy was actually one of the more vocal nations of supporting the Finns during the Winter War, even if the Carcanos they sent weren't all that useful. Their at least support was there. It basically pushed Finland into alliances and agreements with Germany. Again, the Treaty of Moscow did not forbade outright, although Russia didn't want it to happen, but it wasn't forbade from doing so. So partnering with Hitler's Germany wasn't against the rules. Maybe it should have been. And of course, at this time, the Nazis aren't viewed like we view in history. A lot of the stuff was not well known, and even if Finland knew the dark side to it, they're up against the communists. It's not like Stalin's regime is any nicer. So you're kind of literally in between two rocks. No hard places. And Sweden's feeling it too. And then Norway falls to the Germans. You get, of course, Russia took Poland. At this point, 1940, Russia and Germany are still allies. So it's even looking like Russia's part of the Axis, or at least Axis adjacent. It makes sense to the Finns to partner with Germany to keep Russia from going for them. So in 1940, you see closer relations, and then you also see small arms in Finland being developed. Before the war, there were plans, including a new rifle and a new handgun, But the Winter War came too early and they were ill prepared. And they had a few thousand of the KP-31s, but their efforts to ramp up production at Tikokoski in 1939 were less than successful. It gave them time for feedback from the soldiers, though. And that's actually where the muzzle brake comes from, the SJR, a add-on feature that Lahti himself hated. But one of the things soldiers said was it's a little uncontrollable in automatic fire. The muzzle rises. So they added that in 1942 is what happened to the design after testing. There were also some efforts to keep the barrels from corroding. As I said in the first video, 2 barrels were issued with each gun. I wonder if it's the fact that the Finns had a habit of sticking the barrels directly in snow to cool them quickly in combat that might have led to some rusting too. Either way, they also refined production techniques and were able to scale things up. So when another order would come through to increase rate of production in 1941, they were actually able to achieve it with the KP-31. In fact, at their peak, they were able to make about 1,500 per month. Now, one thing that proved very successful was the 70-round drum. In fact, as we know today, it was so successful that Russia copied this with their PPSH-41. The PPD-38 and 40 used different things. Of course, this is a 9x19. The Russians were 7.62-25, but here and there. And this was, about the third effort. The first mag for the Suomi was a 20-25 round stick, and then they went to a little 40-round drum, and this was kind of a double-sized 40-rounder. But in between the wars and at the beginning of the Continuation War, a new style of mag was developed for the Suomi, but actually in Sweden. They would design this 60-round casket quad-stack coffin mag. And in 1939, the Finns would actually obtain about 250 for testing. And then after the Winter War, they would get a license from Sweden to manufacture these. And they had some great benefits. By 1941-42, they started to make them. They also had them imported. They're lighter and cheaper to make than a drum. Less bulky. They don't really hang down much further. Hold near as almost the same number of rounds. The detraction, they are somewhat easily dented. And you cannot load one without a tool. Because it is a single feed, but quad stack, you've got to have the loading tool. They would typically either issue up to 5 drums with each Suomi, or 7 casket mags as the Continuation War. So what about the war itself? How did it get going? The relationship between communist, Bolshevik, Soviet Russia, and fascist Nazi Germany fell apart, which they both were planning on. They were both planning to stab each other in the back. Again, between Hitler and Stalin, there are no good guys. But Russia's performance during the Winter War actually might have spurred Hitler to increase his plans, to push him forward. Therefore, June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa steamrolled into Russia. And it was so unexpected that Stalin almost went catatonic and wouldn't believe it was happening. And Finland, being Nazi Germany's ally, would take advantage of this. Their goal was to retake the land lost during the Winter War and, regain prestige. But they would hold off. The first shots fired in the Continuation War would actually be some Soviet bombing raids that would hit some Finnish targets on June 25. But about a week after Barbarossa began, around June 29, the Finnish military would have a major offensive pushing into Karelia and trying to retake the lands lost And it would actually be successful because, one, it was backed up by some German troops, and two, Russia had pulled away several of its divisions to bolster, defense lines elsewhere. So, for once, the Finns have a numerical superiority. And other guns are coming online. Let's talk about sidearms. In video 1, we talked about how Finland was using a hodgepodge of handguns, some old, some new, like the high power Lugers, Rubies, Old Swede, and Colts. Well, they want to standardize, and having the Suomi submachine gun helps a lot, and it really brings Lahti into focus. And this is how we end up with another iconic Finnish design, the L-35 pistol. Sometimes also called the Suomi pistol. And this is pretty much what he developed, at least successfully, after the submachine gun. In 1929, the Finnish military requested a new handgun to be made domestically, to be cheaper than the Luger, easier to field strip, and basically tailored for the cold, and it needed to be able to penetrate a helmet, all that good stuff. Basically, they just wanted to make their own. And so, by the end of that year, the very first prototype is made, the L-29, and it does pretty well. It uses kind of a Bergman-style wedge system. The ergonomics are very Luger-esque, but it's absolutely not a Luger. You have a heel mag release, and you have a charging system that kind of reminds me of a Nambu single-action trigger. Very positive manual safety. And the first prototype does well. It goes 6,000 rounds. So then they try to streamline it and slightly cheapen it for mass production with the L-31 prototype, and it fails. So next we have the L-29-35, and it goes into testing. A couple of pistols made. And the Army provisionally accepts it. It's having problems. Minor things like sometimes the trigger accidentally goes into full auto mode. And with an 8-round mag, that's not really useful. And, some reliability things. So they said, well, we'll order some. They put it in an order for 2,500. They arrange for production at VKT. But they need to fix it. So there's a period of revision. And in 1938, the first handful of prototypes and pre-productions are submitted, just under 100 total. And then in March of 1939, a further updated version, around 30 pistols are submitted for trials. One of the big things, they went to Bakelite synthetic grip panels. Originally they used wood, but this was giving problems in the cold. They also eliminated a few things, like there was a couple of interesting devices. It still has the kind of bolt accelerator in here, but there was some other things. Like back here, you can see where it used to be devices to kind of further aid in the cold that just weren't necessary. Now, they still had the loaded chamber indicator. And so this would get essentially from the kind of pre-production series to the first production series at VKT. The order had actually been increased to about 7,600 at this point because they know war is coming. And they do start to ship these before the Winter War. But there were fewer than 500 in inventory in November of 1939. So technically, you can say they served in the Winter War, but not really. This is a chunk of a pistol. It's a over 4.5-inch barrel. Overall length is about 9.25 inches, and it weighs about 2.5 pounds unloaded. But it is easy to field strip, I'll give it that. And one of the other things, they wanted to have fewer parts than a Luger, and that's true as well. The magazines are unique, proprietary, and designed to work with the mag loader, again with mittens and gloves on. I'm sure this pistol is very happy to be in the cold. They did slot it for a shoulder stock, but that really never got much past the prototype stage, and stocks were never issued. To be fair, the Finnish Air Force was using some high powers with stocks, so it's kind of where that came from. The whole shoulder stock thing was just a 1930s idea. You see it a lot, and then World War II disabuses it very quickly. So anyway, when the Winter War ends in March of 1940, they've just about shipped 1,100 pistols to them, kind of completing the first series. And then when the continuation war kicks off in June of 1941, they've shipped another 1,500. So there's, around 2,600 in Finnish service at this time. So not near the numbers they would need. And that actually led to another program. They would take some of their Lugers chambered in 7.65 and rebarrel them. Tikakoski made the barrels for 9mm, also polishing the feed ramp a bit and reworking that. Now this one is a much later rework. They would phosphate it. Originally they'd have wood grips. They would go to polymer later on, so just ignore that. But they would rebuild a lot of their PIST 23 or M23 Lugers, 30 caliber Lugers, to fire 9mm. They used a 123 grain cartridge at the time, and these were renamed as the PIST 08 or M08. And I don't know how many were converted, but several thousands, because they would remain in Finnish service for decades longer. So these were done to supplement Lahti production. Originally, the goal was to produce about 1,000 L-35 pistols every 3 months, so roughly 4,000 a year. Yeah, they got better with mass production, but it was relatively low priority. So even during the continuation war, the handgun situation was kind of less than ideal. But they would actually make a second run of the L-35, and they would delete some machining. They would finally get rid of this useless kind of bulge back here. And this second run, around 1941-42, would be 1,000 pieces. And then there was a third run that really eliminated a lot of machining steps. It's a much blockier looking gun. They also went to kind of a squared off loaded chamber indicator bulge between 1943 and 1944, and this would have around 2,000 pieces, the majority delivered during the continuation war and some immediately after. And that meant, all told, around 5,800 L-35s would enter into Finnish armed forces services during and after all the wars. So not quite the original goal. Now, they would produce more than that. They would do some for export. Places like Israel would buy them in the 50s. And they would even do a few commemorative runs for the civilian market. But even then, production was under 9,000, making this a pretty uncommon gun. And meaning, roughly, say, 2/3 went to the Finnish military. It was a well-suited gun for the cold. And it was actually very easy to manufacture, given the technology that Tikakoski and VKT, these were all made at VKT, but just saying, Finnish industry had at the time. But it is a chunk. It used a great deal of steel. And, frankly, it's a handgun. Things like submachine guns naturally take higher priority. But, officers need guns, guards, that kind of thing, air crews maybe, because the Finnish Air Force is expanding and modernizing rapidly in 1941-42. And speaking of rapid, after the offensive started in June, it pushed the Russians back very quickly. In fact, by August of that year, they'd already reached the original border pre-Winter War. Now, Finland had really mobilized over 500,000 active troops. Now, they couldn't sustain this number for very long because it was pretty much all their male population. Keep in mind, Finland has a population of under 4 million, and they had already suffered losses during the Winter War. But for this point, they're pretty big. They're also supplemented by 200 to 220,000 German Wehrmacht forces in the country. So you're looking at a force of between 700 and 750,000. And these are up against a force of roughly 500,000 Russians, Red Army. Again, they pulled off several of their divisions. The ones that remained, morale was less than great because their homeland's being invaded. Training was less than great because Red Army. And supplies were less than great because Red Army. So the Finns have the upper hand with German support. They're getting other assets from them, food, ammunition, things they were running short on during the Winter War. And the Allies are not pleased. At first, they kind of in between. Remember, they had reached out to Finland, trying to sway them over there to the side, but the fact is that the Germans just made a better offer. But then in December, Britain officially declared war on Finland, so they're on the side of the Axis. They don't want to say that they're an Axis power. Finland doesn't. They want to say they're a co-belligerent. Essentially, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We have common goals, namely against Russia. But up through August, you can understand. They're pushing to their border. But then they push further into Russian territory. And they keep pushing because the idea is that the Finn army will link up with the German army as it takes Leningrad. But Mannerheim was a pretty shrewd dude. He saw German troops, how they were performing, how things were going after the initial successes of Barbarossa, and wasn't sure that they were going to be able to do everything they said. So in December, he kind of quietly orders a halt, a cessation of progress. It wasn't that the Red Army had just pushed them back. I mean, obviously there was fighting back and forth, but he doesn't want to push too deep into Russian territory because he's not sure the Germans are going to uphold their end of the bargain. And they don't. Obviously, there's a siege of Leningrad that's very tragic and harrowing and costly to both sides, but they never take the city. So the Finn army could have never linked up with the German army as planned in kind of encircling everything there. So it was a shrewd decision. But it also turned what was rapidly mobile warfare into basically trench warfare. The Finns would not retreat, they would just dig in. So now Finland's having to supply these troops. And so as 1942 rolls on, nothing's happening. Little skirmishes here, but it's not a priority to the Russians because they're, fighting the Germans in Maine. And it's not a priority to the Finns because they don't really know what to do exactly. Hitler does try to convince Mannerheim. He has a meeting with him. In fact, there's a very famous recording of it in June of 1942 to, hey, get more aggressive, push against the Russians. We'll back you up. We'll give you more food, more bullets. Yeah, we're going to win this thing. Again, Mannerheim isn't so sure. Now, am I saying he wanted Germany to lose? No, they would have been happy to be on the winning side, but, he's acting like a pragmatist. But yeah, 1942 is just a pretty stagnant year, but it does let Finland re-equip. It lets some of their soldiers rest, kind of stand some down so they can go back home to work in industry and farms. And it allows them to finally field a new rifle they had been planning for over a decade. In the 1930s, while Finland has standardized on the 7.62 by 53 cartridge, their variant of 7.62 by 54 Russian rimmed, they have a huge range of Mosins to fire it. So, same basic platform, sure, and cartridge, but they've got original 1891s, their modified M91s, some older M24s, and then you have the M27 of the Army, and the M28 and M2830 of the Civil Guard. Plus, you've even got some small numbers of the M27RV, a 20.5-inch barrel cavalry carbine of the M27. This is a logistical and production nightmare. So, one thing that the Army and Civil Guard can agree on is we need a one-size-fits-all standard rifle. The issue is, what should it feature? Because each side has things they like about their own gun and things they criticize about the other's gun. You know, the Army knew that their M27 had the splitting issue, but they fixed it with the tabs and all that, at least for the most part. This has a 46.5-inch barrel, but the Army actually likes that RV carbine, so they're really pushing for a 20.5-inch or so universal carbine. And they feel that now with the improvements, their gun is durable, dependable, and able to be scaled for mass production. They criticize the M28, M2830. They say it's not as strong, and that the sights, while excellent marksman sights, are too fragile and not well suited to like military engagements. You know, they're more of sniper sights. Simo, hey, would show us. So, yeah. What do they want? So what the Army wants is basically the M27 RV with a few updates and improvements for production. The Civil Guard, on the other hand, they're very happy with their M2830. In fact, they just proposed a somewhat updated version of it. They criticize the Army's idea for going to a universal carbine. It'll have too much flash, too much recoil, and it won't have accuracy and range. And they both have ideas. Again, the Civil Guard had basically an M2830, which was quite new at the time, and the Army had the M35 prototype. And so we're kind of at a standstill for a while. They need something, but they argue back and forth. Until finally, by 1939, essentially the Army relents and agrees to the Civil Guard's M2830 update, although they do make a few updates and changes to suit their needs. And we have production starting up. We'll have almost all the makers involved. Mishaco, VKT, even Tchaikovsky gets involved. And technically, we do have all of 10 of these in the Armed Forces' hands in November 1939 when the Winter War kicks off. Arguably the best standard infantry issue, full production, Mosin type gun of all time, the M39. And this is almost an entirely new design. New furniture, new barrel hardware, new barrel profile even compared to the other guns. But the only things really being reused from existing Mosins, again, receivers. Finland never made receivers, as we said in video 1. And most of the bolts were just refurbished and recycled, original bolts. A lot of your magazine bodies are recycled too. And some small parts inside are recycled. Other times they would make these. And that's kind of the problem. For Finnish industry at the time, it took them quite a while to set up. Even though they had officially adopted it in like April of 1939, like I said, by November they only had 10 essentially trials guns. And it would still be a little while longer before they would go into full production. In fact, it didn't really start by the time the Winter War ended. These didn't start to appear into the field until 1941 at all, and in numbers by 1942. This is actually why older guns like the M91 were put back into production at VKT and Tchaikovsky. And they kept producing the M27 and M2830 a little longer than planned, just to have guns. But eventually, these are up and running. The Army would order from Mishaco in 1940, initially around 20,000, and then that would increase time and time again. And then the Civil Guard would place an order about a year later for 20,000, although this would actually never be fully delivered. And VKT would get involved, or rather, I should say, VKT made barrel actions, and final assembly was done at AV3, that depot. We talked about AV1, AV2, AV3 in the first video. And even in 1942-43, during the Continuation War, Tikakovsky would make barrels. And there's even a few of the Belgian-made B barrels that were modified to work with this gun. Now, this is your standard Mosin for the most part, action. It doesn't have the wings or anything, but it's obviously in a very different style of stock. Arctic birch, so all new. We have bottom and side sling mounts. That's one of the concessions. You know, that way it could be used as a cavalry-type carbine or infantry rifle. The sights are basically the Civil Guard sights, except they do give it a 150-meter battle setting to appease the Army. We have quite a nice thick handguard. This barrel is 46.5 inches like previous guns, and is of a heavier profile compared to Mosin's, but it's actually slightly lighter overall compared to the 2830 and M27. So that means it's not interchangeable. The bayonet lug is the same though, so it takes the older bayonets and everything. And the end cap is actually a neat little hybrid of both. It has the hinging system of the M27, but it's a single piece design like the M2830. Cleaning rod is also kind of a Mauser style. We have the dog-eared front sight protectors, all that good stuff. Another noteworthy change has to do with the bore. Previous thin barrel guns had a tight bore, call it 308 or so, for that 7.62 by 53 cartridge. They're trying to squeeze accuracy. And I get it. Makes sense. They have limited numbers of men. Make them count. But fighting with Russia, they know that they're going to capture quite a bit of their 7.62 by 54 cartridge, which tends to be more for 310, 311 type bore. Especially you see this was like the M44 carbines. They can have 312, 313. Anyway, so the bores on these tend to be just slightly wider, little lighter diameter, so they'll fire the Finnish cartridge as well as Russian cartridge, and it does give a little bit better reliability, kind of addressing Army concerns. Accuracy is great and all, but you can push it too far and end up with problems. Maybe getting stuck in the chamber. These didn't have chrome line bores, obviously. So yeah, they're put into production. First the Army places the order, then the Civil Guard does, and then they start to be delivered. And delivered. Now, it's interesting. In 1942, the Civil Guard and the Army are further integrated, almost becoming the same. There's still a little bit of distinction by the time the Continuation War ends, but they're getting very integrated. This is why of the 20,000 or so ordered by the Civil Guard, only about 10,500 were delivered, because they were primarily focused on delivering for the Army. But they were able to finally ramp up production to nearly 98,000 delivered during the war. And that number would jump to nearly 102,000 M39s built immediately after the war and into the 50s, because this would stay the standard service rifle of the FDF, the Finnish Defense Forces, as it would be known, until 1965. So it had some stand power, and it was a good gun. In some ways, you look at it and go, well, it's just a Mosin, but it's kind of a Mosin pushed to the end, and they were very effective with these. And they continue to fight with the Russians, and the Germans would still have troops on their soil, hundreds of thousands. But by 1943, obviously the tide is turning. The Finns are quite experienced at playing both sides off the other, and after things like the Battle of Kursk, they can see the writing on the wall. Despite German assurances that they'll still win the war, they'll pull it out, they start kind of putting out feelers with first other allies like Britain, and then eventually even Russia. Let's end this war. They know that they've kind of backed the wrong horse. And they're not the only ones. You'll see other nations formerly allied with the Nazis, like, say, Romania, start to shift. Hungary, too. Yeah, everyone's kind of leaving the sinking ship. Unfortunately, Russia's first response to Finland is unconditional surrender. That's not acceptable. Even if Finland did, there's still German troops on their soil. Therefore, after 2 years of not much happening, in 1944, Russia has a large troop buildup, nearly 1.5 million men on the Finnish border. And on June 9 of 1944, they start a major offensive to push the Finns back from where they've been essentially dug in, and to steamroll the country. And for about a month, the Finn army is in retreat. However, the Russian push into Finland would eventually be halted in July of 1944 after some of the absolute largest battles ever in history for that region. And we kind of end up with another standstill. The political environment is changing. And again, at first Stalin's insisting Finland has an unconditional surrender. But losses are mounting. They want to push into Berlin. This is post-D-Day at this point. In August, peace talks begin. Russia's no longer insisting on absolute unconditional surrender. They're open to terms. There may not be favorable terms to Finland, but terms, not just like, And probably to everyone's relief, on September 4, there's an official ceasefire called. And then, on September 19, the Moscow Armistice is signed between Finland and Russia, officially ending the continuation war. But those terms. Not surprisingly, Finland has to give back all the territory it had taken during the continuation war. Second, they have to expel the remaining German troops, which are still over 200,000 in Finland, ASAP. Not just like, let them retreat, or no, push them out, fight them out. Basically, they have to officially turn on and fight their former allies. Which obviously they agree to because, what else are they going to do? But this frees Russia up to push into Berlin. And, of course, the Battle of the Bulge will happen. Germany's not happy about this, but, at this point, they're not happy about a lot of things. So before we move in to the kind of third phase of the war, what were the results? What were the numbers? During the continuation war, Finland had about 50,000 KP-31 submachine guns and a handful of others, including some captured Russians we'll get to in a minute. As for Mosins, the single most fielded version was the M39, with nearly 100,000 made. They had roughly 70,000 older M27s, M28s, M2830s, and they actually had a large number of captured 9130s, some of which, a few thousand, they would rebarrel, many they would refield and rework. It's hard to say exactly what number, but I've seen 50,000 bannered about. There was also well over 100,000 just like older Mosins, 1891s, 91s, just that kind of thing, all Mosins. On top of that, we still have the Swede 96. They still have, 70,000 or so of those, and they obtained roughly 75,000 Carabiner 98Ks, K98s from Germany. Kind of like with the Italian, though, there was a non-standard caliber for them, but at least it was what they considered a better gun. So they had those, and they had some other things too, MP40 submachine guns, various pistols, some P38s, and these are just small arms that I kind of focus on. Of course, we have all kinds of light machine guns and anti-tank guns. They captured quite a few from Russia, and still have quite a few old Maxims. Even some of the Finnish-made L-26s are knocking about, even though they're not super popular. As for the numbers of losses, Finland lost over 63,000 men killed in action, with another nearly 160,000 wounded, injured. Some minor, some crippled for life. On top of that, their allies, the Germans, lost over 14,000 men in Finland, with double that, about 30,000, injured, wounded. So that drew, nearly 50,000 men away that could have been fighting the the Russians in areas, or the Allies anyways. As for Russia, though, so those sound good. I mean, they lost quite a bit in the continuation war. But Russia had losses. At least 250,000, 250,000 killed. Some sources say over 300,000. With another 600 to 700,000 injured, wounded. Some minor, some major. And on top of that, you had nearly 65,000 POWs. Now, yes, the Finns had some POWs too, but relatively small, about 5,000 or so. Although they didn't fare so well in Red Army gentle care. Imagine that. And I think this is another reason why the Russians were willing to agree to terms, because yet again, the loss ratio was absolutely not favoring them. So with that, in late September of 1944, we kick off the so-called Lapland War. Per the terms of the armistice, Finland couldn't just let the Germans leave in an orderly retreat, as I said. They had to really push them. And to make sure they did their best, the Russians had a committee in Helsinki watching things. And if they didn't, Russia had the right to just invade them. So, the first battles between the Germans and the Finns in the Lapin War would be around September 28, 29 of 1944. And essentially, the Germans would be retreating towards the Norwegian border. Remember, they're still occupying Norway. And the Finns would harass them all along the way. In return, the Germans would persecute, abuse Finnish civilians, and very quickly adopted a scorched earth policy, which would ultimately not be all that good. The last heavy fighting would start to taper out by December, as the nearly 200,000 Germans started to cross the border, and the last big battles would be in January of 1945, although the war would still continue for another few months. And with that, I have one more gun, kind of a bonus gun, that almost saw service not only in the Lapland War, but even could have been there for the continuation war. The Tikikoski KP-44, i.e. the 10 Henry. Finland captured a great number of Russian guns during the wars, including their submachine guns. At first it was, of course, the PPSH-41 and the PPDs, and they did consider rechambering the PPSH-41 for 9mm. There was some testing in 1942, but it really wasn't economical. It didn't work out so well. On the other hand, they considered adopting 7.62 by 25 Tokarev as a standard round, but they never had enough captured Russian submachine guns to really warrant this either. I think at their peak they only had like 4,000, 4,500. But in 1943-44, especially with the new offensive, they started encountering a new Russian gun, the PPS-42, the first production version of the PPS-43. Now this they can work with. The PPS-42-43 was actually developed in the city of Leningrad during the siege, and was not ever really meant to replace the Papa Shah, the PPSH-41, but rather supplement it. It was made of sheet steel, it was light, it was compact, folding stock. So, in late 1943, the Finns took some of their captured guns, rebarreled them for 9mm, and tested them that November, and results were very positive. So the idea, hey, the Russians copied our drum for the Papa Shah, let's copy their submachine gun, but chamber it for 9mm. It's not an identical copy for anyone who owns one. Obviously the wood grips stand out, but also the whole front trunnion area, because of the wanting to accept the drum is different. Stock is a little changed as well. Still has the muzzle brake. So they figure out, we want to do these, but where to make them? Well, VKT, Sacco are busy, so they do a lot on Tikakoski. And they put in an initial order. They were hoping to get 50,000. And the first pre-production models are available in July. So still technically during the continuation war. And this is when the Russian offensive is still going, so the numbers. But then in August, the army scales back their order to just 20,000 because, peace talks are ongoing. And then in September, after the armistice, it's scaled down to just 10,000 because, resources are already there. It's also worth pointing out that KP-31 production would end around this same time as well. And they were still going to make these stamped metal, but they weren't available. At least not until early 1945. It's, likely that some of the earliest KP-44s were being delivered while the Lapland War was technically ongoing. But the truth is, between February and April, when it officially did end, it was just small pocket fighting between the Finns and the Germans. They would ultimately build 10,400 of these. Most in 1945, 46, a few more in the 50s. They did consider restarting production in the 50s, but they never did. And about the only deployment they had was in Suez in 1957. It's worth saying that the Finnish border guards did like this gun for being light, compact, easy to use. And this is actually where the now famous 36-round stick magazine would come from in the 1950s. The Lapland War. The results. Well, Finland would lose another 1,000 men with around 3,000 injured, but really the cost was to the civilian population. Many more were displaced, and Lapland itself was, it went through scorched earth. There was a lot of damage there. The Germans, for their part, lost about 2,000 men, and we don't know how many were injured, captured, otherwise. It's, kind of hard to say this towards the end of the war. So, not near as heavy losses as the Winter War or Continuation War, but, still death and mostly destruction. And this does satisfy the terms of the Moscow Armistice, so therefore Russia is not going to occupy Finland as such. However, there's still a bit of a reckoning to occur. There has to be a full treaty between Finland and the Allies because, again, they were on the side of the Axis. But again, there's a lot of brilliant political maneuvering. I mean, look what Russia did to the Baltic states. They just took them over. How did Finland remain independent? And how did Finland even prosper despite, or maybe even because of the terms of what would be known as the Paris Accords? Negotiations and writing of the accords would begin in 1946 after bigger fish had been fried, frankly, with the Allies. And they would officially be signed on February 10, 1947, with an effective date beginning September 15 of that year. First off, they just kind of reaffirmed the Moscow Armistice. Finland had to give back the territory going to the Moscow Treaty of 1940. They also had to further lease for a Russian base. It was going to be for 30 years, but actually ended up only being for about 10. They had to shrink down their military. The army was only basically limited to 42,000 men. This actually meant that the Civil Guard was disbanded in 1944, and even the Sacco Company was kind of broken apart. The Navy was limited to only about 3,000 active sailors and basically could only have small patrol boats, essentially a Coast Guard. And the Air Force was limited to just 60 fighters. So they were allowed to keep their armed forces, but yeah, there were restrictions. On top of that, they had to pay war reparations, equivalent today for about 4-5 billion. Back then, it was well over a quarter million. But it wasn't just straight in money; it was actually industrial goods production. And funnily enough, this might have been a benefit to Finland because they had to pay back the Soviets. It really inspired them to modernize and tool up their industry and become an exporter. And they would continue this because they actually were able to pay off their reparations by the early 50s. So, some benefits there. Politically, they had to outlaw far right wing, essentially fascist parties. They had to agree to pursue and prosecute, hand over Nazi war criminals. Even some in the Finnish government that were more closely tied with the Hitler regime were put on trial. No big surprise there. And keep in mind, this wasn't just with Russia, although they were the primary, ally they're dealing with. This is for France and the UK and everyone. And then finally, they had to basically agree to remain neutral in future European affairs, especially with Germany. No partnerships with Germany, and basically just stay out of it. Because already by 1947, things are changing. We'll get to the point of the Berlin airlift and then, of course, atomic bombs. By the way, no surprise, Finland is not allowed to develop nuclear weapons. Yeah, it's kind of obvious. But again, they're allowed to keep their government. They're not occupied. And Russian forces will leave the country that year. That's part of their deal. Again, they had kind of a oversight group there since the end of the Invention War and the Lapland War. So they're going to leave. Considering things, it could have been a lot worse. That's why I find Finnish Smallarms very fascinating. Considering they were such a young nation, they were able to go toe-to-toe with one of the largest powers on Earth and hold their own. Did they technically win any of the wars? Well, I guess maybe the Lapland War, technically. But no, they lost. But they lost in a way that gained them a lot of prestige and admiration, especially the Winter War. That was a clear example of Russia was being belligerent. Again, should they have agreed to the offerings that Russia had in 1939, October? In hindsight, maybe. But then again, nations don't want to give up territory, even if Russia was kind of offering to pay for it. But in 1941, the Continuation War, siding with Nazi Germany, history's not going to look favorably upon anyone who does that. But the reasons, well, that's just it. That's a lesson for modern times. Things are not clear-cut. We don't work in a black and white world that only revolves around morality. I'm not saying they didn't make some questionable decisions, and again, they were perfectly happy to play the Nazis' game if it would gain them. But what choice did they have? They had a legitimate fear they could have ended up like Poland or any other number of nations that Russia would steamroll into. And keep in mind, when they really got close with the Germans and Russians were allies. So what are you going to do? Yeah, they kind of ignored the French and the British offerings in 1940 to help, but considering how that turned out for them with the Battle of Dunkirk and all that, can you blame them? It was pretty clear in 1940 who was the up and rising power. They still fought, and they were very politically minded. They were quite masterful about playing both sides off with each other in 1943-44. And I think that's why I like their Smallarms too. They were very innovative. But the fact that they were able to put up such a good military showing and also be a little bit out of the way, let's be honest. And I think with the support of Sweden, who would also remain neutral, they were able to kind of balance things out. And this would continue throughout the Cold War period. This is why Finland did not join NATO and just kind of stayed out of things. This is also why you see Finland doing a lot of stuff to stay more or less on Russia's good side, but also not alienating the West. And this lasted for decades upon decades, just until the last few years, when finally the peace of the Cold War, which remained in place even after the Cold War ended in Europe, was shattered. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has changed everything, and this is why it was a big deal when Finland applied for and accepted NATO membership. Once again, after decades of feeling more or less comfortable next to Russia, they felt like they needed protection. And I can't blame them. Their past experiences kind of mirror what is claimed on Ukraine. Ukraine was once Russian or Soviet territory. They won it back. Finland was too. Up until 1918, it was part of Russia and had been for centuries. This is the world we live in. And just like back then, today it's not black and white. Be careful what you start, because sometimes it's difficult to end it. And hindsight's always 20/20. Again, with the weather, not able to go out and shoot, I thought, let's talk fin guns. But it should be above freezing this weekend. And so very soon, once the mud dries, we'll be able to get out and get back to the range and get to more active videos. But yeah, love to discuss these in the comments below. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. Like to help support us, check out Patreon. With that, it's getting dark. I'm hungry, getting cold. This is Misha. See you very soon.